The little girl's words hung in the air like a melody frozen in time. "She sings like Mama," she whispered, unaware of how those 4 simple words would change everything. The widowed rancher, calloused hands gripping the doorframe, stood transfixed by a truth he wasn't prepared to face but couldn't bring himself to walk away from. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The Wyoming Territory greeted each day with an unforgiving chill, even as early spring whispered promises across the plains. Jonah McCrae had been awake for an hour already, his calloused hands moving through familiar motions in the pre-dawn darkness. The leather of saddles and bridles responded to his touch with creaks that had become a comfort over the years, sounds of certainty in a world that offered little. His ranch sat like an island of resistance against the encroaching railroad tracks that cut through neighboring properties. Jonah had watched those steel lines advance month by month, bringing with them the thunderous roar of progress he neither wanted nor trusted. The homestead itself stood weathered, but proud, much like its owner, a testament to stubbornness and survival. Inside the modest ranch house, memories of his wife haunted every corner. Her absence was a presence all its own, lingering in the faded curtains she had sewn, in the empty chair at the table where she once sat, in the silence that had replaced her laughter. 3 years had passed since illness had taken her, yet Jonah still found himself pausing at doorways, half expecting to see her there. "Pa?" The small voice behind him belonged to Ella McCrae, her hair still tousled from sleep. At 7 years old, she had her mother's eyes, a fact that sometimes made it difficult for Jonah to meet her gaze directly. "You're up early," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Words were precious commodities to be spent sparingly in the McCrae household. The child approached cautiously, her movements deliberate as if navigating an invisible boundary. "I heard you getting ready." Jonah nodded, softening slightly as he reached for the coffee pot. Their mornings followed this careful choreography, him preparing for the day's work, her seeking connection in the narrow spaces his grief allowed. On the mantelpiece sat Ella's treasures, a hairbrush with strands still caught in the bristles, a faded ribbon, a small portrait. These keepsakes of her mother were touchstones for the girl, who would sometimes stand before them in silent communion. Jonah had caught her whispering to the portrait once, sharing secrets with a memory. Outside, the ranch hands were stirring. Cattle needed tending, fences required mending, and the unending work of the land waited for no man's sorrow. Jonah knew this, embraced it even. Physical labor was his refuge, exhaustion his only reliable path to sleep. "Can I help with the chickens today?" Ella asked, her small fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. The rancher managed a smile, brief but genuine. These rare expressions were sunlight breaking through clouds for his daughter, who collected them like precious stones. "After your lessons," he answered, knowing that duty must come before desire, a lesson he was determined she learn early. Together they faced the Wyoming morning, father and daughter bound by loss and love, their shared silence speaking volumes about storms weathered and those yet to come. Clara Bennett descended from the dusty stagecoach, her knuckles white around the handle of a battered leather satchel that contained everything she owned. The Wyoming Territory sprawled before her, vast and indifferent to her troubles. She brushed trail dust from her skirts, squinting at the small town that would either be her salvation or another disappointment. "Last stop, ma'am," the driver called, already loading new passengers. Clara nodded her thanks, though her throat tightened with uncertainty. St. Louis lay far behind her now, along with the hardships she'd fled. The main street bustled with afternoon activity, cowboys tying horses outside the general store, women exchanging gossip by the milliners, children chasing hoops through the dirt. Clara straightened her spine and walked purposefully toward the saloon, the only establishment likely to hire a woman with her particular talents. Miss Calhoun, a sharp-eyed woman with graying hair pinned severely atop her head, assessed Clara with a calculating gaze. "Can you play?" she asked, gesturing to the upright piano in the corner, its keys yellowed with age and tobacco smoke. "I can play and sing," Clara replied, setting her satchel down. Without waiting for permission, she seated herself at the instrument, letting her fingers find familiar chords. The melody that emerged, melancholy yet resilient, silenced the few afternoon patrons. By evening, she had secured lodging in the small room above the saloon and a position that would keep her fed, if not wealthy. Clara's voice filled the smoke-laden air each night, transforming the rough establishment into something almost genteel for brief moments. "That new girl's got a voice like church bells," one rancher commented, tossing coins into the jar beside the piano. Another spat tobacco juice and muttered, Pretty voice don't mean she ain't running from something." The singer ignored such speculation, focusing instead on the keys beneath her fingers and the words that carried her through each evening. Within a week, her performances had become the talk of the small community, some approving, others suspicious of any newcomer with unexplained origins. On a quiet Tuesday evening, the saloon door creaked open to admit Jonah McCrae, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floorboards. The rancher nodded curtly to Miss Calhoun, clearly uncomfortable in the establishment but determined in his errand. Behind him, peering around his legs with wide, curious eyes, stood little Ella McCrae. Clara's fingers never faltered on the keys, but her heart quickened as the child's gaze fixed upon her with undisguised wonder. The song she sang, a gentle ballad of home and belonging, seemed to wrap around the little girl like an embrace. When Clara finished, silence hung in the air for 3 heartbeats before Ella tugged at her father's sleeve, whispering something that made the stoic man's expression shift almost imperceptibly. The wheels of fate had begun to turn. Jonah McCrae hadn't intended to bring Ella into town that day. The supply run was meant to be quick: flour, sugar, coffee, and back to the ranch before sunset. But the babysitter had fallen ill, and he couldn't leave his daughter alone. Now, standing in the doorway of Miss Calhoun's establishment, he regretted his decision. The saloon wasn't crowded this early, just a few men nursing drinks and playing cards. What caught his attention was Ella, who had wandered toward the piano where Clara Bennett sat, her fingers dancing across the keys. His daughter stood transfixed, eyes wide with wonder as the melody filled the room. "Papa, she makes the most beautiful music," Ella whispered when he approached, tugging at his weathered coat. The rancher nodded curtly, uncomfortable with how entranced his child seemed by this stranger. A saloon singer, no less. Clara looked up, her playing never faltering. Her eyes met Jonah's briefly before returning to Ella with a gentle smile. "Do you like music, little one?" she asked, her voice as melodious as her playing. "More than anything," Ella replied with unusual boldness. "We don't have music at home anymore." Jonah winced at his daughter's words. Music had died with his wife 3 years ago, along with much else in their household. "Miss Bennett," Miss Calhoun called from behind the bar. "Mr. McCrae here might need help at his ranch. He's been looking for someone to assist with household matters." Jonah shot the saloon owner a sharp glance. He'd mentioned no such thing. But before he could object, Ella was bouncing with excitement. "Please, Papa! She could teach me piano and help with the chickens and—" "Ella," he said firmly, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. Clara's fingers stilled on the keys. "I'm looking for more stable work, Mr. McCrae," she said quietly. "I can cook, clean, and I'm not afraid of hard labor." Something in her steady gaze made Jonah pause. Not desperation, but determination. He needed help. That much was true. Winter was coming, and the ranch demanded more hands than he had. "It's not an easy life," he warned. "Few worthwhile things are," she answered simply. 3 days later, Clara arrived at the McCrae homestead with her single satchel. The ranch hands eyed her curiously as Jonah showed her to the small room off the kitchen. That evening, after a surprisingly hearty stew she'd prepared, Clara sat beside Ella's bed, humming softly while mending a torn shirt. The melody drifted through the house, reaching Jonah where he sat by the fire. He heard his daughter's voice, clear and innocent in the quiet night. "She sings like Mama," Ella whispered, not knowing her father could hear. Jonah closed his eyes, memories washing over him like floodwater. He should send Clara away tomorrow. He knew he should, but he didn't. Jonah McCrae stood frozen in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, arms folded tightly across his chest. The lamplight cast long shadows across the worn floorboards as Clara Bennett's melody drifted through the small bedroom. Her voice, soft yet clear, wrapped around Ella's small form like a blanket. The rancher's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering with memories he'd tried so hard to bury beneath years of silence and work. His daughter's words hung in the air between them. "She sings like Mama!" 4 simple words that had torn open wounds he thought had scarred over. He should send her away. The sensible thing would be to thank the singer for her help and return her to town tomorrow. Back to the saloon, where she belonged. Not here, not in his home, not singing lullabies that made his chest ache with remembrance. Yet his feet remained rooted to the spot. Clara's eyes met his briefly over Ella's drowsy form, a question in them that he couldn't answer. The former saloon performer lowered her gaze respectfully, continuing the gentle song without missing a note. Her fingers smoothed Ella's hair with a tenderness that made Jonah's throat tighten. "Papa, can Miss Clara stay?" Ella murmured, fighting sleep. "Just for a little while?" The widower opened his mouth, then closed it again. Words had never come easily to him, even before grief had stolen what little eloquence he possessed. Instead, he gave a single curt nod before turning away. Behind him, he heard Clara's soft, "Good night, little one," and the rustle of blankets being tucked around his daughter. The Wyoming wind whistled through the cracks in the homestead walls, a familiar sound that had been his only company through countless lonely nights. Later, as embers glowed in the hearth, Jonah sat at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of cooling coffee. Clara moved quietly around the room, washing the few dishes from their evening meal. Neither spoke. The silence between them was fragile, like spring ice on the creek. One wrong step, and they'd both plunge into waters too deep to navigate. "I'll make up the spare room," he finally said, his voice rough from disuse. Clara paused, dish towel in hand. "Thank you, Mr. McCrae." He nodded again, unable to meet her eyes. Tomorrow would bring questions, decisions, complications. But tonight, for the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel quite so empty. The hush that had defined his existence since becoming a widower was broken not by words, but by the lingering echo of a song, and with it, the faintest whisper of hope. Wyoming spring arrived with a rush of green, transforming the barren landscape around the McCrae Ranch. Clara Bennett rose each morning with the sun, her hands already accustomed to the calluses that came with ranch work. What had begun as temporary help was evolving into something neither she nor Jonah had anticipated. In the corral, Clara demonstrated a natural gift with the horses that surprised even the most seasoned ranch hands. A particularly skittish colt that had bucked two cowboys now stood quietly as she ran her hands along its flank, whispering words only the animal could hear. Jonah watched from the fence, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never leaving her form. "Never seen Thundercloud let anyone touch him like that," remarked Bill, the oldest hand on the ranch. "The lady's got a way about her." Evenings found Clara sitting with Ella at the kitchen table, patiently guiding the child's finger across pages of a worn primer. "Sound it out," she would encourage, her voice soft but firm. The little girl's progress was remarkable, and sometimes Jonah would pause in the doorway, listening to his daughter's voice grow confident with each new word. Clara's days blurred into an endless cycle of cooking, cleaning, mending, and tending. She rose before anyone else, and often retired last, determined to prove her worth beyond any doubt. The ranch hands, initially skeptical of the saloon singer, gradually began nodding respectfully when she passed, accepting the coffee she poured without the sideways glances that had marked her first weeks. Yet beyond the boundaries of the McCrae property, whispers persisted. When Clara accompanied Jonah and Ella to town for supplies, she felt the weight of stares from the church ladies gathered outside the general store. Their hushed conversations stopped abruptly as the trio approached, resuming with greater intensity once they passed. "Miss Bennett," Mrs. Peterson called out one afternoon, her smile not reaching her eyes. "How interesting to see you settled into ranch life. Quite a change from entertaining at the saloon, I imagine." Clara merely nodded politely, but later that night, Jonah found her scrubbing the kitchen floor with unnecessary vigor, her knuckles white around the brush. "Town talk doesn't matter here," he said simply, the most words he'd strung together for her in days. She looked up, surprised. "It matters to Ella." "Ella thinks you hung the moon," he replied, then awkwardly added, "Rest your hands. Floor's clean enough." That night, Clara placed a small vase of prairie wildflowers on the dinner table, the first decorative touch she'd dared to add to the McCrae home. When neither Jonah nor Ella removed them, something shifted in the air between them, subtle as a change in wind direction, but undeniable as the spring itself. Jonah McCrae watched Clara from the corner of his eye as she sat by the hearth, needle flashing in the firelight. His work shirt, torn during a long day mending fences, was draped across her lap, her fingers moving with practiced precision over the worn fabric. He hadn't asked her to fix it. She'd simply picked it up after supper, saying nothing as she threaded her needle. These small, unbidden kindnesses were becoming routine, each one chipping away at the walls he'd built. Yesterday, she'd packed extra biscuits in his saddlebag before he rode out to check the eastern pasture. The day before, she'd polished his boots without being asked. Each gesture felt like a question he wasn't ready to answer. "Papa, look!" Ella's voice pulled him from his thoughts. His daughter was showing Clara how to braid a leather strip, her small hands guiding the woman's fingers. The sight of them, heads bent together, lamplight catching in their hair, made something twist in his chest. Later that evening, after Ella had fallen asleep against Clara's shoulder, the singer carried her to bed with a tenderness that made Jonah's throat tighten. He stood in the doorway, watching as Clara tucked the blankets around his daughter, brushing dark curls from her forehead. "She reminds me of you when she sleeps," Clara whispered, not turning around. Same furrowed brow. The rancher said nothing, but when Clara passed him in the narrow hallway, their shoulders brushed, a contact neither moved to avoid. The next morning, after the ranch hands had ridden out and Ella was collecting eggs, Jonah found himself standing before the kitchen shelf, staring at a leather-bound book he hadn't touched in 3 years. His wife's cookbook, filled with her handwriting, stained with ingredients from meals long past. He'd kept it closed, preserved like a relic. Clara entered, carrying freshly churned butter, and stopped when she saw him. Without explanation, Jonah lifted the cookbook and held it out. "Margaret wrote notes in the margins," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "About what worked. What didn't." Clara Bennett took the book with both hands, understanding the weight of what she was being given. "Are you sure?" she asked softly. He nodded once, watching as she carefully opened the cover, her fingers tracing the faded handwriting inside. "Thank you," she whispered. That evening, biscuits made from Margaret's recipe graced their table. Ella chattered through the meal, oblivious to the significance, but Jonah noticed how Clara followed his late wife's notes exactly, not changing a thing, honoring what came before. It wasn't forgetting. It was making room for what might be. The unforgiving Wyoming sun beat down on the McCrae Ranch as summer took hold of the territory. The grass turned golden, and dust devils danced across the plains. With each passing day, the heat grew more oppressive, settling over the homestead like a heavy blanket. Jonah McCrae gathered his men for the seasonal cattle drive, a necessity that would take them away for weeks. The rancher's weathered face betrayed little emotion as he gave Clara Bennett final instructions, but his eyes lingered on Ella longer than usual before mounting his horse. "We'll be back before the moon cycles twice," he said, adjusting his hat against the glare. "The north pasture needs watching." "Wolves have been spotted," Clara nodded, standing tall beside Ella as they watched the men disappear into the shimmering horizon. The singer-turned-ranch hand felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. This would be her greatest test yet, proving she could maintain the homestead alone. The days stretched endlessly. Clara woke before dawn and worked until her muscles screamed for mercy. She hauled water from the well, tended the vegetable garden, and mended fences broken by summer storms. Her hands, once reserved for piano keys, now calloused from ranch tools and daily labor. One evening, Ella pointed toward the chicken coop. "Look," she whispered, eyes wide with fear. Clara grabbed the shotgun Jonah had left by the door. In the fading light, yellow eyes gleamed, wolves drawn by hunger to the ranch. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she fired a warning shot into the air. The predators scattered, but she knew they would return. That night she moved Ella's bed near hers and slept fitfully, waking at every sound. The next day she reinforced the chicken coop with extra boards and set up a makeshift alarm system using tin cans and wire. When the well pump broke, Clara spent hours in the blistering heat repairing it, refusing to let their water source fail. Ella watched in awe as the woman figured out the mechanism through sheer determination. "How do you know how to fix everything?" the child asked. "I don't," Clara admitted, wiping sweat from her brow. "But I know how to try until something works." The isolation weighed heavily at times. No visitors ventured to the remote ranch, and the endless prairie seemed to swallow all sound, except the wind. Yet in this solitude, Clara found unexpected strength. She sang to keep their spirits up, old ballads, cheerful tunes, lullabies that made Ella smile. When a dust storm hit, they huddled together in the main house, sealing windows with wet cloths as the world outside turned brown. Clara told stories of faraway cities to distract the frightened child, creating adventures from her own memories of St. Louis. Each challenge conquered was a silent victory, proof that she belonged, not just as a hired hand, but as someone who could protect what Jonah held most dear. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon before Jonah McCrae himself became visible. Clara shaded her eyes against the late afternoon sun, her heart quickening as she recognized his silhouette leading the men back from the cattle drive. She wiped her hands on her apron and called for Ella, who came running from the chicken coop with excitement lighting her face. "Papa's home!" the child squealed, bouncing on her toes as the riders approached. Jonah dismounted with the weariness of a man who'd spent weeks in the saddle. His eyes, however, betrayed his surprise as he surveyed his property. The fence along the north pasture stood repaired. The barn door, which had hung crooked for months, swung true on new hinges. Even the garden had expanded, rows of vegetables stretching toward the horizon in neat green lines. "Welcome home," Clara said, standing tall despite her nervousness. "There's fresh water for washing up, and supper will be ready soon." The rancher nodded, his gaze lingering on details that spoke of care and competence. Ella wrapped herself around his legs, chattering about how she'd helped Clara mend chicken coops and collect eggs every morning. His weathered face softened as he listened to his daughter's animated stories. That evening, after Ella had been tucked into bed, Jonah sat at the kitchen table while Clara served fresh bread with the stew she'd prepared. He broke off a piece, the steam rising as he pulled it apart. "This is good," he said after a moment, his voice rough from disuse. "Better than Sarah's, even." The words hung in the air between them. Clara froze, stunned by the comparison to his late wife. It was the first time he'd spoken her name in Clara's presence. "I didn't mean to," she began. "No," Jonah interrupted, looking as surprised by his admission as she was. "It's the truth. No sense denying it." He told her then about the wolves they'd fought off during the drive, about the buyers in town, about the fair price they'd gotten for the cattle. Simple words, but they represented something profound. Conversation rather than instruction, sharing rather than commanding. Later, Clara stood at the window, watching as Jonah checked the horses one last time before turning in. She noticed how he paused by the repaired gate, testing its strength with a push of his hand. His nod of approval, though small, meant everything. In the quiet of the evening, something had shifted. The walls Jonah had built around himself and his daughter weren't gone, but the first cracks had appeared, small fissures letting in light where before there had been only shadow. Clara hummed softly as she finished the dishes, a melody of cautious hope. Clara Bennett had been at the McCrae Ranch for nearly 3 months, yet the whispers from town still followed her like shadows. While chopping vegetables for the evening stew, she caught fragments of conversation between the ranch hands outside the kitchen window. "Miss Calhoun's saloon girl," one muttered, "playing house with the widow and his child." Clara's knife paused momentarily before resuming its steady rhythm against the cutting board. She had expected this. In small communities like theirs, reputations clung tight as burrs on wool. The true test came on a crisp autumn morning, when Martha Green's wagon rolled up the dusty path to the ranch house. Jonah's sister-in-law stepped down with pursed lips and critical eyes, her dress impeccably pressed despite the journey. "I've come to see my niece," Martha announced, barely acknowledging Clara's presence. Ella burst from the house, embracing her aunt with genuine affection. Martha's demeanor softened momentarily as she presented the child with a ribbon-wrapped package, a porcelain doll from the general store in town. Over tea, while Ella played nearby, Martha's true purpose emerged. "A growing girl needs refinement, Jonah," she said, stirring her cup deliberately. "Proper schooling, proper company." Her gaze flicked toward Clara. "Not just ranch dust and stable hands." Jonah shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Ella's happy here." "Is she? Or is she simply making do?" Martha lowered her voice. "People talk, brother, about your arrangement with Miss Bennett." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks but kept her eyes lowered, continuing to mend one of Jonah's shirts by the window. "My arrangement is employment," Jonah replied stiffly. Martha leaned closer. "A woman from a saloon, living under your roof? What would my sister think?" The room fell silent except for Ella's humming as she dressed her new doll. Clara stood quietly. "I'll check on the bread." She slipped into the kitchen, giving them privacy while fighting back the sting of Martha's words. Later, after Martha's departure, Clara found Jonah on the porch, staring at the horizon. "You don't need to stay," he said gruffly, "if it's causing you trouble." Clara watched Ella playing in the yard, the child who now ran to her with scraped knees and nightmares. "I'm not troubled by words," she replied, "only by the thought of leaving." That evening, Clara taught Ella to braid her hair, ignoring the phantom weight of judgment that had followed her from town. Each slight, each whisper only cemented her determination. This place, these people, were worth fighting for, even if the battle was fought in silence, one small kindness at a time. Amber leaves carpeted the pathways to the county fairgrounds as autumn painted the Wyoming territory in rich hues of gold and crimson. The annual fair had transformed the usually quiet town into a buzzing hub of activity, with farmers displaying prized livestock and women showcasing preserves and needlework. For most residents, this gathering marked the end of harvest and the last community celebration before winter's isolation. Clara Bennett had reluctantly agreed to participate in the singing competition at Miss Calhoun's insistence. Standing on the makeshift stage, her voice carried across the fairgrounds, silencing even the most boisterous attendees. She sang a haunting ballad about finding home after long wandering, her eyes closed as her fingers danced across borrowed piano keys. When the final note faded, the crowd erupted in applause, and the judges unanimously awarded her the blue ribbon. "You've got a gift from God himself," declared the town's minister, pressing the ribbon into her palm while townsfolk gathered to offer congratulations. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Clara felt a sense of belonging beyond the ranch boundaries. Yet her triumph felt hollow. Back at the McCrae homestead, Ella had spent the day pressing her small face against the window, watching the distant road for her father's return. Jonah had forbidden her attendance, citing chores and the inappropriate nature of certain fair activities. "Too many strangers," he'd muttered, his jaw set in that familiar stubborn line that brooked no argument. "Did they like your singing?" Ella asked when Clara returned, the child's eyes bright with curiosity about the world beyond their fence line. "They did," Clara answered, placing the blue ribbon in the girl's eager hands. "I wished you could have heard it." That evening, as Clara prepared supper, she caught Jonah watching her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Heard you won," he said finally, his voice gruff. "News travels fast," she replied, continuing to knead dough with more force than necessary. "Ella should have her schooling before frivolities," he explained, though no explanation had been requested. Clara stopped her work, flour dusting her forearms. "She needs more than just reading and figures, Jonah. She needs to see the world beyond these acres." His silence spoke volumes. Clara recognized the fear behind his protectiveness, fear of losing his daughter to the same world that had claimed his wife. The rancher retreated to the barn without another word, widening the gulf between them. It wasn't anger that separated them now, but the weight of unspoken worries. His fear of change, her fear of never truly belonging, and the question that hung between them like morning mist. What future could they possibly share? The autumn chill brought more than just changing leaves to the Wyoming territory. Men in tailored suits and polished boots arrived on the morning stagecoach, their leather portfolios bulging with papers and promises. Railroad agents, they called themselves, though many townsfolk whispered they were more like vultures circling dying cattle. Jonah McCrae watched from the doorway of the general store as they set up temporary offices in the hotel. 3 neighboring ranchers had already sold their land, pocketing what seemed like fortunes to simple folk. The McCrae ranch sat at a crucial junction where the proposed tracks would need to pass, making his property particularly valuable to the railroad men. They offered the Hendersons enough money to move to California, Clara Bennett said quietly as she loaded supplies into their wagon. "Mrs. Henderson was crying with joy at church yesterday." The rancher merely grunted, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. But Clara had learned to read the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the reins too tightly. That evening, after Ella had been tucked into bed, one of the agents arrived at their door. The man spread maps and contracts across their kitchen table, pointing to figures that made Clara's eyes widen. Jonah remained stone-faced, asking pointed questions about water rights and access roads. "I need time to consider," he finally said, showing the agent to the door. Later, Clara found him staring at the documents, his brow furrowed in concentration. "These words," he muttered, "they twist themselves around." Without comment, she sat beside him and began reading aloud, her finger tracing each line of the dense legal language. Her voice, steady and clear, transformed incomprehensible jargon into understandable terms. Years of reading sheet music had given her an eye for detail that proved unexpectedly valuable. "This clause here," she pointed out, "would give them rights to more than just the strip for tracks." Night after night, they pored over the contracts together. Jonah's knowledge of the land complemented Clara's ability to decipher the fine print. Their heads bent close over the papers, shoulders occasionally touching as they worked. "This land isn't just dirt and grass," he confessed one evening. "It's Ella's birthright. Her mother is buried on that hill." Clara nodded, understanding what remained unspoken. This partnership, her reading, his listening, their shared concern for the future, had formed a bridge between them that neither dared to name. "We'll find a way," she said simply, her hand briefly covering his calloused one. In that moment, protecting the McCrae legacy had become her fight too, though neither acknowledged the shift from your land to our problem. The railroad men would return for their answers soon enough. But for now, in the lamplight, their silence held more truth than any contract could capture. The cattle were grazing peacefully in the afternoon sun when the distant train whistle pierced the air. Jonah McCrae had just dismounted his horse when the first signs of trouble began. A ripple of movement through the herd, ears pricking up, bodies tensing. Before he could shout a warning, the entire herd bolted, thundering across the plain in a cloud of dust and panic. "Head them off at the ravine!" Jonah yelled to his ranch hands, swinging back onto his mount. The men scattered, racing to prevent what could be financial ruin. If the cattle plunged into the ravine or scattered beyond recovery, the ranch wouldn't survive the winter. Back at the homestead, Clara Bennett heard the commotion. She rushed outside to see the distant dust cloud and immediately understood. Grabbing Ella's hand, she hurried toward the barn for safety, but the child broke free, running toward the corral where her pony was kept. "Ella, no!" Clara shouted, sprinting after her. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the first wave of cattle veered toward the homestead, driven by blind panic. The singer caught up to the girl just as the fence began to splinter under the pressure of the stampeding animals. With no time to reach the barn, Clara pulled Ella beneath the water, Truff shielding her with her body as hooves thundered past and wooden debris flew through the air. She hummed softly in the child's ear, a steady counterpoint to the chaos surrounding them. When Jonah finally returned hours later, exhausted and mud-streaked, his face went ashen at the sight of the damaged corral. "Ella?" he called, voice cracking with fear. Clara emerged from the barn, Ella's small hand in hers. "We're safe," she said simply. That night, after the child was asleep, Jonah found Clara mending a torn shirt by lamplight. "You saved her," he said, the words hanging heavy in the quiet room. "I promised I would care for her," she replied, not looking up from her needle. "No," Jonah said, his voice unusually soft. "You didn't just watch over her. You put yourself between my daughter and danger." He paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily. "Thank you." The rancher turned to leave, but stopped at the doorway. "We lost 12 head today. Could have been worse, much worse." His shoulders slumped slightly. "Everything can change in an instant out here." Clara nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The stampede had nearly cost them everything. The cattle, the ranch, Ella. Yet somehow they had weathered this storm together. As Jonah left, Clara's fingers traced a small bruise on her arm. The fragility of their existence, this makeshift family, this tentative belonging, had never felt more apparent or more precious. The floorboard creaked beneath the small rug in Ella McCrae's bedroom, drawing Clara's attention as she helped the child prepare for bed. Ella froze, her eyes widening with the unmistakable look of a secret discovered. "What's under there?" Clara asked gently, watching as the young girl's fingers twisted nervously in her nightgown. "Promise not to tell, Pa," Ella whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind whistling through the cabin walls. When Clara nodded, the child knelt and carefully pulled back the rug, revealing a loose board beneath. With practiced movements, she lifted it to expose a weathered wooden box tucked into the darkness. "It's Mama's things," she explained, carefully extracting the container. "Pa put everything away after she died. Said it hurt too much to look. But I couldn't forget her." Clara sat beside Ella on the small bed, watching as small hands reverently opened the lid. Inside lay treasures of a life cut short, a silver hairbrush with strands still caught in the bristles, a handkerchief embroidered with wildflowers, a small bottle of perfume nearly empty, and a journal bound in faded leather. "She smelled like this," Ella said, carefully uncorking the perfume bottle and offering it to Clara. The scent of lavender and something sweeter, perhaps vanilla, drifted between them. "Sometimes I put a tiny drop on my wrist when I miss her most." Clara's throat tightened as she watched the child handle each item with such care. "Your mother had beautiful things," she said, careful not to disturb the sanctity of the moment. "Will you read from her book?" Ella asked, pushing the journal toward Clara. "I can't read all the words yet." Hesitantly, Clara opened the journal, feeling as though she were intruding on something deeply private. The pages contained not only words but pressed flowers, sketches of the ranch, and notes about Ella's first steps and words. "Your mama loved you very much," Clara said, reading entries that detailed Ella's childhood milestones with such tenderness that her own eyes grew damp. They sat by lamplight, Clara reading selected passages while Ella leaned against her shoulder. Neither noticed Jonah standing in the doorway, watching silently, his expression unreadable in the shadows. When Ella finally drifted to sleep, Clara carefully returned the treasures to their hiding place. Rising, she found herself face to face with the rancher. "I didn't mean to pry," she whispered, expecting anger. Instead, Jonah's voice came rough with emotion. "She never showed me that box." "Perhaps she was protecting you," Clara offered, "just as you've protected her." Something shifted between them then, an understanding that the past need not be forgotten to make room for the future. The memories, once locked away in grief, now formed a bridge connecting all three of them across time and loss. The crunch of wagon wheels on gravel announced Martha Green's return before anyone saw her. Jonah McCrae looked up from mending a fence, his weathered face tightening at the sight of his sister-in-law's rigid posture as she approached the homestead. "I've come for Ella," Martha announced without preamble, her gloved hands clutching a leather satchel. "This is no proper environment for a young girl. She needs refinement, education, things you simply cannot provide here." Jonah stood his ground, hammer still in hand. "Ella stays with me. She's my daughter. A daughter who needs a woman's guidance," Martha countered, her gaze sweeping dismissively over the ranch. "What future does she have here among cowboys and cattle? In town, with me, she could become a lady." Inside the house, Clara Bennett heard the rising voices and found Ella huddled by the window, eyes wide with fear. The singer placed a protective hand on the child's shoulder. "She wants to take me away," Ella whispered, her small fingers clutching Clara's skirt. Outside, the confrontation escalated. Martha's words cut sharp as winter wind. "Your stubbornness will ruin her prospects, Jonah. What would my sister say if she saw her daughter raised in dust and isolation?" "Don't you dare use her memory against me," Jonah's voice dropped dangerously low. "My wife loved this land as much as I do." Clara stepped onto the porch, Ella close behind her. Martha's eyes narrowed at the sight of them together. "And this is your solution? A saloon singer playing mother?" Martha scoffed. "The entire county talks about it." "Let them talk," Clara said quietly, her hand steady on Ella's shoulder. "What matters is that Ella is loved and cared for." "By you?" Martha challenged. "By all of us," Clara answered, her voice unwavering. Ella suddenly broke free, running to stand between her father and aunt. "I won't go. This is my home. Clara helps me read and tells me stories about Mama. She's teaching me to play piano." Martha's expression softened momentarily at the child's outburst, but her resolve remained firm. "Jonah, be reasonable. Think of her future." "I think of nothing else," he replied, moving to stand beside Clara and Ella, the three of them forming an unintentional but unmistakable unit. Martha recognized defeat in their united front. With pursed lips, she retreated to her wagon, promising to return when sense prevailed. That night, after Ella finally slept, Jonah found Clara on the porch, staring at the stars. "Thank you," he said simply. Clara nodded, understanding the weight behind those two words. The threat had passed, but Martha's visit had exposed their vulnerability and the strength of the bonds they'd formed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the stagecoach that rattled through town once a week. Clara Bennett unfolded the cream-colored paper with trembling fingers, her eyes widening as she read the carefully penned words. The Westward Touring Company, a respected music troupe she'd once dreamed of joining, offered her a position as their featured vocalist. 6 months on the road, performing in theaters across the Western Territories, with pay that exceeded anything she could earn at the ranch. "What is it?" Ella asked, noticing how Clara's face had gone pale. The singer tucked the letter into her apron pocket. "Just news from an old friend," she said, but her voice wavered just enough for the child to sense something significant had shifted. That evening, Clara sat alone on the porch steps, watching the Wyoming sunset paint the distant mountains gold. The opportunity pulled at her like a physical force. Stages, applause, a life devoted to music rather than mending fences and feeding chickens. Yet when she closed her eyes, she saw Ella's smile and Jonah's rare moments of warmth. Jonah McCrae noticed the change immediately. Clara's songs grew softer at night, tinged with a melancholy that hadn't been there before. He found the letter 3 days later, fallen from her pocket while she hung laundry. Though he returned it without reading its contents, the rancher recognized the embossed letterhead of the touring company. "You've had an offer," he said that night after Ella had gone to bed. Clara nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "They want an answer within 2 weeks." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. The widower turned away, his shoulders rigid with the familiar tension of anticipated loss. He wouldn't ask her to stay, couldn't bring himself to voice the need that had grown in him these past months. "It's what you've always wanted," he finally managed, his voice rough. "What I wanted before," she corrected softly. The following days passed in a fog of uncertainty. Jonah threw himself into ranch work, staying out until dusk, avoiding the homestead where decisions waited to be made. Clara caught Ella watching her with worried eyes, as if the child could sense the precarious balance of their makeshift family. One evening, Clara found a small wooden box on her bed. Inside lay a simple silver hairpin that had belonged to Ella's mother. "Papa says you should have something pretty," Ella explained, "for when you sing." Clara closed her fingers around the pin, understanding the gift for what it was. Not permission to leave, but acknowledgement that she might. The family they'd carefully constructed now stood at a crossroads, with all three hearts suspended between what was and what might be. The crack of wood and Jonah McCrae's shout echoed across the yard. Clara dropped the laundry basket and ran toward the sound, her heart pounding. She found him pinned beneath a fallen beam from the barn roof he'd been repairing, his face white with pain. "Don't move," she commanded, summoning two ranch hands who helped free him. Jonah's leg was badly twisted, the bone visibly broken beneath his torn trousers. Clara tore strips from her apron to bind the wound while sending young Tim galloping for the doctor. "I can't lie around," Jonah protested through gritted teeth as they carried him to the house. "Spring calving starts next week." Clara's eyes met his. "Then you'll have to trust me." That night, after the doctor had set the bone and prescribed 6 weeks of bed rest, Clara sat beside Jonah's bed. "I'll handle things," she said quietly. "You focus on healing." Dawn found her in the barn, issuing orders to skeptical cowboys who exchanged dubious glances. Old Pete, the most experienced hand, crossed his arms. "Miss Bennett, with all due respect, you don't know the first thing about rotating the north pasture cattle to prevent overgrazing, or about checking the pregnant heifers twice daily?" Clara interrupted, her voice steady. "Mr. McCrae explained everything before the laudanum took effect. Now, are you going to stand there questioning me, or shall we get to work?" The men followed her lead, reluctantly at first. By midday, Clara had inspected fences, organized the feed schedule, and helped deliver a breech calf that even Pete admitted would have been lost without her quick thinking. Each evening she brought ledgers to Jonah's bedside, reporting the day's work while Ella read stories to her father. The rancher watched Clara with growing admiration as she detailed cattle counts and repair progress, her hands still raw from work. "The men are taking orders from you?" he asked on the third day, disbelief in his voice. Clara smiled. "Even Pete called me ma'am today instead of miss." Progress, I suppose, when the first spring storm hit a week later. Clara worked alongside the hands through the night, moving vulnerable cattle to shelter. Jonah, propped at the window on crutches against doctor's orders, watched her small figure in the driving rain, directing men twice her size with unwavering authority. "She belongs here," he whispered to himself, the realization settling in his chest like a warm stone. Not as hired help, not as Ella's companion, but as something far more essential, a partner who could stand strong when he faltered. For the first time since his wife's death, Jonah allowed himself to imagine a future beyond mere survival. Clara had proven herself not just capable, but indispensable, in ways that silenced every doubt he'd harbored. The McCrae family's arrival at the white clapboard church caused the usual stir of whispers. Jonah McCrae had never been one for regular attendance before Clara Bennett entered their lives. Now the three of them, rancher, singer, and child, filed into a pew near the back, Ella's Sunday dress freshly pressed and her hair neatly braided by Clara's careful hands. Reverend Hollis nodded toward them from the pulpit, his sermon touching on community and belonging. Throughout the service, Clara's clear voice rose above others during hymns, drawing appreciative glances. Jonah noticed how several of the women who had once gossiped most viciously about that saloon girl now offered tentative smiles. When the collection plate came around, Ella proudly placed the penny she'd earned helping Clara with the chickens. The child beamed up at the woman beside her, seeking approval. Clara squeezed her hand gently, the simple gesture speaking volumes about their growing bond. After the final prayer, Mrs. Patterson approached with her usual questions about ranch matters. Ella, growing restless, tugged at Clara's skirt. "Mama, can we go see the new kittens at the Miller's after?" The words tumbled out naturally, hanging in sudden silence. Jonah froze. Clara's eyes widened, her hand instinctively finding Ella's shoulder. The congregation seemed to collectively hold its breath, all eyes turning toward them. Martha Green, standing nearby with her husband, audibly gasped. "Well, I never," she muttered, loud enough for those around to hear, but it was Jonah's reaction that truly mattered. The rancher stood motionless, his weathered face unreadable. Years of grief and solitude had taught him to hide his emotions, yet something shifted in his eyes. Not anger or embarrassment, but a quiet recognition. Clara knelt to Ella's level, her voice steady despite the audience. "We'll need to ask your father about that," she said softly. Jonah cleared his throat. "I reckon we could," he finally managed, his voice rough but clear. "The three of us." Those 3 words, the 3 of us, resonated through the church. With them, Jonah acknowledged what Ella had already decided. Clara belonged with them, not as a hired hand or temporary fixture, but as family. The town would talk, of course. By supper time, every household would know that Ella McCrae had called Clara Bennett Mama, and more importantly, that Jonah had not corrected her. The public nature of this moment meant there could be no retreat, no pretending their bond was merely practical. As they walked out into the Sunday sunshine, Martha approached, her lips pressed thin. But before she could speak, Jonah took Clara's hand in his, the first such gesture he'd ever made in public, and led his family toward their wagon, the 3 of them together against whatever storms might come. The first frost had settled on the Wyoming plains when the railroad men returned to the McCrae Ranch. They arrived in a polished carriage carrying documents that promised wealth beyond what the land had ever yielded. Jonah McCrae stood on his porch, arms crossed, as they approached with confident smiles. "We're prepared to offer 20% more than our previous proposal," the lead agent announced, unfolding a map across the kitchen table. "The depot would sit just beyond your north pasture. Your cattle could be loaded directly onto cars. No more grueling drives." Clara Bennett watched Jonah's face harden as he studied the papers. The money would solve their struggles. Repair the barn roof, replace aging equipment, ensure Ella's future. Yet the cost was clear. Strangers flooding their valley, trains thundering past at all hours, and the quiet life they cherished transformed forever. "I need time," Jonah finally said, his voice rough with conflict. After the men departed, he retreated to the barn. Clara found him there, methodically brushing down his horse, his movements betraying his turmoil. "What would you do?" he asked without turning. She leaned against the stall door, choosing her words carefully. "The money would secure Ella's education and the ranch's future," she said. "But this place isn't just land to you. It's everything my father built," he murmured. "Everything I plan to leave Ella." "The railroad is coming whether we welcome it or not," Clara replied. "Perhaps embracing it means controlling how it changes us, rather than being swept aside." That evening, they spread the contracts across the table after Ella was asleep. Clara's experience reading documents proved invaluable as she identified clauses that needed amendment: water rights, access roads, noise restrictions. "You're thinking like someone who plans to stay," Jonah observed, his eyes meeting hers. "I am," she answered simply. The next morning they rode together to the highest point on the property. Below them stretched the valley, the ranch buildings tiny in the distance, the land still untouched by progress. "My wife loved this view," Jonah said quietly, said it reminded her how small our troubles really are. Clara nodded. What would she want for Ella's future? "She'd want her to have choices," he admitted. "More than we had." As they rode back, their decision crystallized between them. They would accept the offer, but on their terms, with amendments that protected what mattered most. The ranch would change, but its heart would remain. That night, Jonah wrote his response by lamplight. Clara's steady presence beside him as they charted a course between preservation and progress, between honoring the past and embracing what lay ahead. The blizzard descended without warning, a white fury that swallowed the McCrae Ranch whole. 3 days of howling wind had piled snow against the cabin walls, sealing Jonah McCrae, Clara Bennett, and little Ella inside their wooden fortress. The temperature plummeted as night fell, forcing them to huddle near the hearth where precious firewood burned lower with each passing hour. "We're down to the last of the flour," Clara whispered to Jonah as Ella slept beneath a pile of quilts. The rancher nodded grimly, his weathered face illuminated by the dying embers. They had been rationing food since the second day, dividing portions so Ella would hardly notice the scarcity. That night, as the wind screamed like a wounded animal, Jonah found Clara at the window staring into the impenetrable darkness. "The cattle," she murmured, concern etched across her features. "They've weathered worse," he replied, though uncertainty shadowed his words. His injured leg, not fully healed, throbbed with the cold. Standing beside her, their shoulders almost touching, he felt a strange peace, despite their dire circumstances. By the 5th day, Clara had fashioned new candles from saved tallow, and Jonah had ventured to the barn through a snow tunnel, returning with frozen hands but news that most animals were surviving. Ella maintained their spirits, inventing games and stories that filled the cabin with laughter, despite the growling of their empty stomachs. On the 7th night, with the storm showing no signs of relenting, Jonah found himself speaking of things long buried. Perhaps it was the isolation, or the fear they might not survive, but words poured from him like spring melt. "Sarah would have liked you," he said suddenly, mentioning his late wife's name aloud for the first time in Clara's presence. "Not just because you're good with Ella, but because you face things head-on. No flinching." Clara's eyes widened, her hands stilling on the mending in her lap. "I've been afraid," he continued, voice rough, "not of forgetting her, but of dishonoring her memory by feeling—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "By feeling again," Clara finished softly. Jonah nodded, his throat tight. "When Ella said you sang like her mother, I nearly ran, but I stayed, and every day since I've been grateful for that choice." The confession hung between them, more intimate than any touch. Clara reached across the space and took his calloused hand in hers. "Loving again doesn't erase what came before," she whispered. "It honors it." As if responding to this breakthrough, Ella stirred and asked Clara to sing. And for the first time Jonah joined in, his deep voice harmonizing with Clara's clear tones, creating something new from the fragments of what was lost. Outside the storm raged on, but within the cabin something had thawed that no winter could touch again. The snow melted away from the McCrae Ranch like a retreating army, leaving behind mud, new grass, and the promise of renewal. Jonah McCrae stood on the porch, watching as the Wyoming plains transformed from white to green, much like his own heart had thawed over these past seasons. Inside the house, Clara Bennett's voice mingled with Ella's laughter as they prepared breakfast together. The sound drifted through the open window, wrapping around him like a familiar blanket. Not so long ago, he had flinched at Clara's singing, the notes too painful a reminder of what he'd lost. Now they were simply hers, unique, beautiful, and belonging to this moment rather than the past. "Pa!" Clara made flapjacks, Ella called from inside, her voice bright with the easy happiness that had once seemed impossible. The rancher smiled, a gesture that no longer felt foreign on his weathered face. He entered the warm kitchen, watching as his daughter set the table with careful precision, while Clara flipped the last flapjack with practiced ease. "I accepted the railroad's offer for the eastern pasture," Jonah announced quietly. "Not the depot, just enough land for the track to pass through. We keep the ranch, but gain enough money to improve what we have." Clara looked up, her eyes reflecting understanding of what this compromise meant. "A wise decision," she said simply. "It was your counsel that helped me see the middle path," he admitted, the words coming easier now that he'd learned to speak his mind again. After breakfast, Jonah watched from the barn as Clara taught Ella a new song on the porch, their heads bent together in concentration. The child's small fingers mimicked Clara's movements, her face a mirror of determination and joy. Martha Green had visited last week, her criticisms notably softer when she saw how Ella flourished. That evening, as spring stars appeared above the plains, Jonah took Clara's hand as they sat on the porch steps. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "Ella was right that first night when she said you sing like her mother. But I stayed because you sing like yourself." Clara squeezed his hand, her eyes bright in the gathering dusk. "And I stayed because this became home. You and Ella became home." The McCrae Ranch, once a place defined by what it had lost, now stood as a testament to what could be found. The wind still blew across the Wyoming plains, carrying the scent of grass and promise, but now it carried something else too, the sound of a family whose music was louder than silence, stronger than grief, and as enduring as the land itself.